Ladies and gentlemen, help me with a round of applause. Welcome on stage, Jewel Thompson. We can do it better for her. Hi, everyone. Jewel will be joined by the convener of the Bold New Normal Conference, Lucy Quist.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You need to clap it until they sit down, please.
Take a seat for me. Take a seat. Take a seat. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very... everything here is intentional. And in the first panel, you heard from lived experiences of businesses and leaders in various fields. Mm-hmm. When I encountered Jewel, the thing that really struck me was the opportunity to speak to someone who looks at this same subject, but in an academic, intellectual sense. And the reason why this is important is that in addition to our lived experiences, as Ghanaians, as West Africans, as Africans, one of the things I think we don't do enough of is actually do the research, do our homework. And so it's easy for me to say, oh, I've had a career, I've lived my life, this is what I understand. We have to enrich our qualitative understanding of a topic with what is tangible, fact-based, that is shared amongst many people. And so today in our conversation, which is I'm not interviewing Jewel, because Jewel also said she has questions for me. We're going to look at this more in an intellectual way, but she's the intellectual, not me, just so we're clear. So we're going to kick off. Get your questions ready. This time, the questions have to stay short, and I only want questions. I don't want opinions. Your opinions matter, don't get me wrong, and I like to hear them. But we have the benefit of somebody who has the intellectual capacity to educate us. So ask a question where you're seeking education, as I am. So let's kick off. Welcome once again. You wear so many hats, but I think your hat as a PhD really studying entrepreneurship, systems thinking, and cultural transformation is extremely important to this subject. Yeah. So from your research and what you've learned from your research, what is cultural transformation?
Brilliant. Really great question, Lucy. And so for me, I do want to start with an opinion before I get into the
Okay.
facts. So from an opinion perspective, I've been listening to the conversations, the commentary, and I say one thing we need to get correct or work on is essentially how we communicate. Language is important. And I've heard continuously here, we have a poor culture. We have a poor culture. That's not true. Right? So what we continually say, we actually do, and what we do, we become. So I think that that's something that needs to also begin to be eradicated from us once we actually know what we're dissecting. Because to begin, culture is not homogeneous, right? A lot of people think of culture in one fell swoop, in a very monolith perspective. And when we look at it from there, we're usually looking at culture from a more ethnic and tribal perspective. But there's 3 levels in which we can approach culture. So we can look at that from not only our tribal and our tribal and ethnic groups, but we're looking at it from a political space, and we also then get it down to a more micro level where we can break it down individually when we look at collective groups. So when we look at that definition and understanding what is culture, how do we define it? We've had so many people theorize, what is this culture? And a number of scholars have kind of landed on one thought or around this that's still criticized, which is Hofstede's approach to what culture is with cultural dimensions, a way that we can measure what is culture. So in his definition, culture is a collective programming, right, of how we think, how we live our values, and how we collaborate that. But that is from, again, that more micro level of this looking at it from a more ethnic perspective, whereby it exists in other ways. Now, with that reframing, there was something in my research that I came across that was quite interesting. And this was in 1962, some work by an anthropologist named Kluckhohn, who actually went ahead from that anthropological perspective to define culture, not just as our shared values and perspective, but as a means of survival. So when you think about culture, it is actually something we embed in ourselves to survive, which is why we can see distinct differences in our behavior. So when we look to the West, who has more of this individualistic approach to life, because there are certain infrastructures that exist for them, they can take risks, they can do these things, right? And they're ones who will go for what they want. They're the ones who will go around and colonize. Meanwhile, with us having this very collectivist, communal infrastructure, we're not big on risks. We're part on family. So essentially the way that we behave, we move and respond to things are based on our methods for survival. And survival for us equals community, while survival for others from the West means every person for themselves or their own nuclear family. So you see that difference already happening. And so that's why I say we have to be careful with our language, because we're drawing comparisons to cultures that are very different. Now, coming down, I'm getting this, is, when we're talking about this form of transformation as well. So this is where we just simply see the shift, right, in those presumed assumptions, values, and for the sake of this conversation, looking at it from a more ethnic group perspective, right? And then I think that when we're talking about cultural transformation, we don't have to necessarily talk about it in a perspective of how we are going to abandon our traditions, but it's really about how do we restructure, repurpose, and redesign, or re-embed rather, our traditions into what's happening when we look at innovation, right, going forward. How do we begin to marry that? So we've been taught too long to start abandoning what we do and who we are. So yeah, that's a full swell group, but I just wanted to lay that
Okay,
foundation.
that's a textbook right there. I'm sure for many of you here like me, that's a textbook. But you started to touch on something there that I think is extremely important. And is this idea of thinking of the system, the systems thinking. Because you broke it down for us. And I completely agree that our culture isn't devoid of good things. So we're not saying that everything is bad, but we know there are things we need to shift and adjust, or things that have become abused. But what's interesting, though, is that you talk about how family is what matters to us and community is what matters to us. How then does it so happen that we have such a hard time operating as a system and thinking as a system to produce certain outcomes?
Very good question as well. So I think that when I'm just thinking specifically to Ghana and then connecting it back to the research, is that we've had a disruption in our system, right? So the colonization of our respective West African countries really did a number on us. So when I look at that culturally, when we go back to pre-15th century, we had systems, structures that worked for us in our traditions, particularly if we're looking at the Akan ancestry, then we're looking at the chieftaincy, we're seeing roles, everyone had a process. And I think Arabana, she mentioned this, that we had this kind of matriarchal lineage where women had power, women had authority and voices. And we see that that's lost because, again, post-colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, we've adopted other nuances, right, that impact our particular system. So ultimately, we don't see, I think that what we're dealing with right now is essentially this kind of latent behavior, because if we reconnect culture back to this concept of survival, we're really passive. Right? So our existence right now as a community is extremely passive. So essentially we just kind of pour and chew. We see that in our educational systems. We just take on what is given to us, and we've lost that sense of unique cultural identities that are respective to all 70 and more ethnic groups that exist in Ghana, where we're trying to have this really collective idea of what success is, what systems should be, and it's not clear because we're dismantled. So I think that what we're operating off is kind of a broken system. So most times when you think about systems thinking, we use the iceberg model. And the iceberg model shows us that at the tip of that iceberg, we're seeing the event, which is a result of patterns, structures, and mental models at the bottom of this that are influencing this boss that doesn't respond to emails, this person that doesn't, understand how to essentially speak to an opportunity, someone who's lazy in the office. That's just a result of a mental model that's resting on this, again, broken down system that we have when we look at the country as a whole.
So if I try to join dots here, our previous panel talked about mindsets. You're talking about mental models. They're structured, they're ingrained, but we don't realize that they're structured and ingrained. You talked about us being part of a disrupted system, which I completely agree with you. I actually feel that between Africans and Africans who have been in the diaspora for generations, I always describe us as being two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely.
Right? It's a shared experience, but not shared in the same way, but some of the results are the same. So whether it is an African community or country or another community around the world that has suffered some form of traumatizing disruption. I'm not trying to say that we should make trauma our new language, but something that's disrupted them. Do you have examples where they've managed to make that shift? Because we're all about not only recognizing what we need to change and transform, but taking the action to bring that transformation to life.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually see that happening now in microcosms within our institutions. So even take, for example, the institution that I work at, right, Ashesi. That's a shift in the mindset of saying, how can we re-educate our young people to actually think from a perspective of entrepreneurship and then think from an ethical mindset, right? So that requires a whole unearthing of how we do, what we think of. And so we're seeing some of these educational systems across Ashesi, Academic City, other that are coming up that are actually finding a way to reshape and reframe, how we teach our young people and what these young people are going to come forth and do, because they are the ones that are creating the next wave, next generation, and repurposing and redesigning what our culture was by making sure we're still embedding that particular traditional stance as well and not forgetting who we are, because that was powerful as well, and that got disrupted, yes.
That was powerful, and that got disrupted.
But Lucy, I mean, it's not just about me. I want to understand also from your perspective, you've worked across various industries, different geographies, and I want to understand, how did culture show up for you, and how did you navigate some of those tensions, right, within leadership, where culture came about, from how you operate, the way you were trained and what you did, and then what that looked like for you working both in Ghana, in the UK, and abroad.
That's an interesting one. It's very challenging, the younger you are, to be able to understand that what you're experiencing is about a difference in culture. And navigation requires that we first acknowledge the difference in culture and then figure out what we're going to do about it. So the example I have is actually closer to home. Many years ago, I was asked to go and work in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you'd assume that it's just another African country, so what's the big deal? You're going Africa to Africa. I was going from Ghana to the DRC. First of all, from a perception and language point of view, a lot of people in Ghana had already started sowing seeds of, you shouldn't go there, right? And those were negative seeds, which I tried not to, take on, but I'm sure invariably there's some impact. But what was more interesting for me is that when I got there, I struggled initially with the organizational culture. And it wasn't the work itself, it wasn't what was expected of me, it was the culture that I was experiencing that was a proxy for the culture of the country. So you talked about our style of being passive and being, taking what's been given to us. I find Congolese people actually quite different. Their response to the need to survive is more in your face and more pushy, and more sort of, even in the tone of the way people speak to you, which is normal to them, they're very much, boom, boom, boom. And I initially struggled with this. I'd go home and I'd feel just exhausted, strained, and everything. I didn't really understand until I took the time to really unpack and understand that this was their response and this is their way of running their culture, their country that works for them, and that's what's led to the culture. So what I did differently is, first of all, I had to change my thinking right? That mental model, that mindset that said, this is aggressive behavior. It's not. For them, it's normal behavior. Maybe my Ghanaian sensibilities mean that if you talk some way, I'm like, oh, hang on. So it was making that adjustment. And then the other thing that I did very intentionally was, as a leader, then focused on my people and bringing out what was the best in them. Because the more I saw people perform and respond to our goals and our objectives, the more I felt a sense of alignment, that even if I don't fully understand you culturally, through the work that we're doing, I know that we're going the same place together. So at least we have something in common. And that's how I've ended up building lifelong relationships. There are people who I worked with there who I'm still friends with to this day.
Beautiful, beautiful.
So yeah, thank you for pushing me on that one and pushing me to dig. These mental models or this construct, and ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're writing. I know this is a little bit pushing you out of your comfort zone because it's very intellect, but I want us to become more so that we read on subjects, that we engage on subjects, that we get people who know subjects deeply to educate us. I'm having an education right now. So if you are then a culture that has become a bit passive and receptive, so you receive, you don't, how then, what impact does that have, that cultural setting, have on your ability to prosper?
That's a great question. I like that. That's quite fascinating. So but actually the research shows that, again, if we're looking at culture, again, from both the macro, the meso, and the micro perspective, when we get to the micro analysis of culture, then that's when we're looking at the individual, okay? So as an individual, there are ways in which you are trained within your households, your personal experiences, and to your point, those lived experiences that begin to shape your perception of reality. So then you begin to transform based upon not only your own individual lived experience, but then what that represents within the clan that you're a part of, because we're trying to have acceptance, again, for survival. So we adhere to what we're seeing and what's happening in our space. So if we're talking about how do we shift this, how can we change this? Then what needs to happen is a form of exposure, right? And I think that sometimes when you don't necessarily have an exposure that can parallel your actual existence or lived experience, it's very difficult for you to see another way of thinking, being, or pursuing. So this is why also I think what was beautiful about our times is that from a clan perspective, people were interacting, right? So even from the Akan perspective, you're not supposed to intermarry, right? Essentially, you're gonna marry someone from another clan, and that's someone with another lived experience, cultural perception, and approach to survival. And now you're learning, you're building, and that's growth. Meanwhile, again, what we've adopted from this kind of hermit approach, where we see again from this post-Atlantic trans, and I'm sorry to bring it back to the darkness, is that now our only means for survival is also essentially a loss of identity, a loss of self, and let me just live to get by. Let me not be seen so that I'm not addressed, I'm not hurt, I'm not doing this. And so then that becomes very generational. It's a generational imprint on how you succeed and how you survive. Be quiet, don't be heard, don't be seen. And you see that not only in some African cultures, but also in the diaspora. How we respond to systemic, racism or challenges there is don't say too much, don't be seen, and don't try to be heard, because that's your form of instinctive survival, and that becomes your culture. So we need more exposure. We need more of that re-embeddedness. Cultural re-embeddedness is what Prof. Samuel Bose says in his work about the context of just culture and entrepreneurship, and how we see that growing is this re-embeddedness. So going back to root and cause of what worked and blending that with approaches that speak to where we're moving, right, as a country, as a community, and from a global perspective as well. So the cause for us to say to ourselves, where's the world moving towards? What can I keep traditionally, and how can I blend what's changing so a facet of myself can, again, maintain a level of survival?
Okay, I'm going to come back on that, but the ladies with the mics, I want you to give the mics to 3 people who just tell me one thing. If you're in this room and a popular saying on any vehicle, whether it's a trotro or a taxi, any saying that comes to mind, I'm not judging the saying, just a saying that comes to mind. If you have one, raise your hands, only 3 people, to take that mic, and we'll come back to you. I have a question for you. So with what you just pointed out, Joel, it's interesting that in the context of Ghana, Africa, we don't use the word racism very much for our lived experience, and rightly so. So I'm not encouraging us to suddenly make that our lingo. In fact, even outside of Africa, I don't think it should be, but that's another story for another day. But the experience isn't very different, in my view. What I mean by that is that what people experience in their diasporian communities as racism, I think most Africans, or Africa as a whole, experiences on the global stage, right? So in the microcosm of a Western society, people will say that some people have great experiences, some people have poor experiences, and they will attribute it to racism. But I think equally as Africans, whether it's our heads of state or our heads of business, sometimes when we get into these rooms, it's a reflection of how that micro viewed in a community is then reflected as a whole across the globe. So if we're going to shift and relearn and redo, the question I have, and I'm going to then take the three people before you respond, is that how do we, you talked about exposure, but not a lot of us are going to get a lot of exposure beyond what we see around us every day, or what we see on social media, or what the media in general chooses to present to us, right? So I want you to come back with that thought on what can we practically do to acquire that exposure so that beyond today, the 25th of October, we're intentionally taking in other forms of exposure to shift us. But before we do, did anybody raise their hand on the cho-cho question? Okay, have you given them mics? 3 people, give them mics. Right, 1, 1, 1. Let's start with whoever has a mic. So give us one saying.
There's one here.
One, just the saying, no introduction, just give us the saying.
Fear woman.
Fear woman. Okay, another one, thank you, another one. Diufiase, mind your own business. Diufiase, mind your own business. And then I think there's someone here.
Yes, here. Okay.
Atamfo nyanyame, that means enemies are not God. And then last one here.
Obrane warabo.
Obrane warabo, life is up to you. Yeah. So the reason why I asked, and thank you all for giving those examples, is that you talked about exposure, and part of exposure is what we see and hear every day. These examples that they've given are our real lived experiences every single day. As soon as you can read, you will read, this is what you're going to read every single day. How do we really change our exposure? What can we do practically to shift it? Do these things matter?
They do. They really do. And I think that, when I say exposure, sometimes it may just be what you're continually around and what you're seeing, right? And I don't mean it that, some people may not get the chance to travel. Some people may not get a chance to even be at a conference like this and have opportunities to learn and interact with other people. But I mean, one powerful way that you can begin your level of exposure that's practical, we've all done it, is reading, right? Where can a narrative take you? And that takes us back to our own traditional practices of storytelling, right? When we talk about parables, proverbs that are used to define our culture, our moral standing, behavior, they may sound funny on the chochos and all of these things here, but the reality is that also is reshaping our mindset, right? Because then it should be something where now when we look from just reading on our own, then the call or the charge comes down to our education systems as well. So now you should ask as a child, right? You've seen this. So even asking that question, we don't end there. We can giggle at some of the sayings, but it becomes, well, do you agree with that? Why is that true? How does that come up in your life? Engage in dialogue and conversation about this, and not just accept it as a lived and full truth. So we read, we talk, we engage in dialogue, and that's still holding true to our own traditions of storytelling and passing on those histories that we need, right? So for me, I say that's the most practical way, simplistic, from how we can begin to shape, especially if we're saying we're devoid of being able to travel, have technology, etc. How do we reshape that in our own communities? Is around this reading and dialogue and exchange. Making sure that's intentional, being open to question or ponder on why such is said as a truth, right? And then actually go back and realize the etymology, why did this begin in the first place? And that's what we used to do.
When did we used to do that?
I'd say early, prior, even 400 BCE is where we have documented instances of even when we began our innovations. So this is something ingrained historically in our culture, and I'm talking about just Ghanaian traditions and how our hierarchies worked, how our histories, our stories were passed, and how groups and clans essentially formed.
Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to ask the audience another question. And I want one person to answer this, and you'll have 1 minute to respond. Who here can describe the life of their great-grandparents? Whether it's your mother's side, father's side, I don't mind. I'm not judging. Not your grandparents, the parents of one of your grandparents. Who here can describe their life? I'm not coming to you. Done a speech. We'll come to you later. Who here can describe the life of their great-grandparents?
Dun, dun, dun.
Okay, we have one gentleman who says he can. Okay. Can you give him a mic, please? 1 minute.
Yeah. So my grandpa was first.
Can you be a bit louder, please?
All right. So my grandfather was my maternal grandfather was a musician. He was a teacher. I think he was the first teacher that taught in the government school that was in my village. And then he also became a catechist at a point. What I know he was that he was a musician, so he loved music. So he was able to inspire a lot of musicians around his influence. He was able to also raise a family of mostly musicians as well. He was able to also inspire his wife to be a trader. She traded around the communities around. And one thing I know him for was that he was able to really have a great impact in the village. When you mention his name and that you are a generation after him, say, oh, that's your grandpa. So I saw him to be an influential person. He actually lived music and also helped raise entrepreneurs in the area.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Jewel, I'm sure you noticed what happened there. Mm-hmm. I think we had 2 hands go up, 3. Mm-hmm. I saw one here, one there. I don't know whether there was one here. Okay, one here. That's 4 hands, right? 4 hands, which means that we have a situation where you're saying we used to tell each other stories,
yes,
that we used to tell generational stories, but we don't even know the stories that are only a few generations removed from us.
Exactly.
The person he described was clearly a leader in his community, an impactful leader. And yet I can almost bet that this fine gentleman here has more than on one occasion said that we don't have leaders in Africa.
Exactly.
Right? And yet we forget that we all come from a lineage of leaders.
Exactly.
But we've adopted someone else's story of what they think of a certain crop of leadership. Exactly. Right? So I will take 2 or 3 questions because I know we're nearly at time. But I want to give you back the mic to talk about, we're talking about culture and language. We're talking about the fact that clearly he's heard a story of someone who inspires him in his life, inspires a village. But most people don't have that, right? I have that from some of my ancestors because I happen to have parents who like telling stories, but not everyone tells stories.
Exactly.
So the question becomes, what should we do to go back to that language and communication that gives us the empowering stories that says just because one person in a particular job did something wrong, doesn't mean that my language has to become, we don't have leaders in Ghana, we don't have leaders in Africa. There are many leaders sitting in this room alone, but in everybody's family there have been and there are leaders. Help us with this.
So this is so powerful. It's the crux of everything that we're doing. I know the conversation is very technical, but this is something, Lucy, that you've harped upon. We're talking about the bold new normal. And that's why I started with saying, let's shift the way we talk about ourselves. Because we've all accepted that we're culturally lazy, we're this. And yes, in certain facets, it may be true, but that's true for everybody. You know, some of the speakers here said, don't accept mediocrity. Right? Don't let that be your undertone of your own provisional self. And yet, here we are still accepting the fact we have no leaders, our government is poor, etc. Yes, it is there. But then now, today, as we're sitting here, right, and recognizing the gaps, when I say that there was this systematic destruction of where we looked at our culture then and where it is now, what are we going to do when we take a way to shift our mindsets and say, culturally, it's time for me to start investigating where I come from, who I am. What does that represent for me? Then look to the future of say, how do I maintain this tradition of understanding the type of person that I am? Yesterday, I had a call with my mother before coming here. I was like, Mommy, you know, I know that we're from the Akan region, so tell me a little bit about our clan. Where do we come from, right? And so she told me, okay, well, you're Bretio. Okay, and so when I looked that up, the totem pole for that represented a leopard. Okay, and so when you go even further there, it means that if you're a part of this clan and you represent this, it means that you have to evoke courage in every aspect of what you do. And then also from an ancestral perspective, you can't eat, harm, or kill a leopard, right? Mm-hmm. And that goes for many things. And so that allows me to also reflect, as you can tell by my accent, growing up in the United States, that in a myopic perspective, I'm growing up in a household with a liberal Ghanaian mother in a sense, but there was something she was always ingraining with me that came from where she came from, this concept of culture and self-identity, this boldness that came when she would tell me stories about from where my people came, my grandmother, every day she's telling me something. And so even though I had to step out into another culture, prospectively, for going to school, et cetera, there's a way, there were things that I would never do. It would shift when I'd come home or be around my collective people because that is who I am, and that is what I represent, and this is what's going to be ingrained in whomever I come across, how I treat work, how I treat my own perspective of just building, reading, designing. It was because of I knew where I came from, who I was, and what that represented to me. And then it's a matter of, again, how do we re-embed this? Because it's not to say that everything we knew translates to now and represents now, but there are key facets that are reminders of core identity, mental models that we must adapt to understand that, no, it's not okay to be lazy. No, it's not okay to come into a space and not be creative and vocalize and speak up. We were never those people. You're operating from a different mental model that has shifted from you. So now, when we look at that, we say to ourselves, yes, it may be a situation where we have a hierarchical model, but how do we ensure that, yes, we respect our elders, but this comes in a way that we innovate when we produce or go forward with entrepreneurship? What does that look like? Who do we hold accountable in ensuring our leaders are reflecting what we need, as individuals to say, this is a hierarchical system we come from, and you're not being accountable to what a leader is supposed to represent, right? So this is what we speak to and how we bring power to that. So essentially, everything that we look as a negative, right, becomes an opportunity for us to dive back into the structures that existed, re-embed that, redesign that, and ensure that as the next generation here, who are thinking about a bold new normal, who are thinking about prosperity and what that looks like, that we don't accept what is because this is not our physical truth. And our culture is greater and more than that. And we transform that for ourselves. And that can be through language, the art of storytelling, maintaining our own dialects, talking amongst ourselves and our people, and then thinking about how we can transform that innovatively. How does that speak to the creations that we develop? Right? That we don't lose that. We're trying to adopt so many other systems that it does not reflect what works for us and what we've done. When we come historically from a people that have been innovative, that have been leaders in their communities, that have been entrepreneurial, this is an opportunity to change that. So either you're going to remain passive, which is fine. You can say passivity, accept that, and carry on, leave here, and continue blaming everybody else. But then, if you really want to leave here empowered and emboldened, that it means that I'm going to take responsibility and accountability to myself, my history, and where I'm from, and I'm going to find that out, happen on that, and actually innovate that and shift that. So that's what I would hope people take away from it.
I love that. I love that. I love that. I love that. Look, we're practically out of time, but give me two questions. Two questions in the room.
We can take 3 questions.
We can take 3. Okay, 3 questions in the room. The moderator has spoken, so we have to. Short questions. right? Short questions, and Jewel will be around, but I hope at the very minimum you're inspired to investigate more, to learn more for yourself, and not just go with what's on the cho-cho. Yes, my dear.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Khadija Anderson.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for your shares. My question is, how do we use new media today to advance the cultural transformation?
Good. So when we think about new media, right, you're talking about our channels that are online, digital medias, your TikToks, et cetera, and things. So essentially, Khadija, to your point is, let's go back. How do we tell a story, right? So what is the story that you're trying to tell? That hasn't died. Just because we have new media, we still have platforms that are paid off of storytelling, right? How boldly you can bring this to light. So it's not just about the story, but alone saying, how do we make this significant and how do we make this relevant, right, to others? So how do we draw those connections? So essentially, if you're gonna use the example most of us have heard of, like Anansi, right, and some other cultures haven't heard of this, you know, mischievous spider, how can you bring that and connect that to how one might think about building an organization or a system? And drawing those parallels and getting someone drawn into the fact that, you know, there's always going to be this mischievous person about, but here's how we can go about leveraging that particular knowledge and tell a story in that way. So I think that that hasn't been lost just because we have new media, right? But it's all about how do you keep that attention and ensuring there's relevance and significance in what you're saying and drawing those connections back to what is traditional to us.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Great question. Great response. Can we take one from here? Well, we have a hand up here as well, so can you... Oh, this...
Right.
Sorry.
Hello,
Hi.
Ross.
I'm Wilbert from Dominion TV.
Hello, Wilbert.
Wilbert.
Hi. Thank you for your open door policy. Lucy and I have been having very wonderful conversations on WhatsApp. So that's very amazing. I wrote my question down so I don't end up giving a speech. When it comes to property ownership, business and investment in Ghana, there's a growing disdain towards foreigners. Nigerians, Chinese, Indians, Lebanese, who are also very heavily legacy-minded. And so, yet, like you mentioned in your statements, we often lack the same survival instinct and individual drive they exhibit. So what kind of reform should we pursue, and where does this change, genuine change begin?
Ours is not about reformation, it's about enforcement. The rules exist, they're there, we have them, but who's enforcing them? So if we don't see enforcement and accountability from those who have taken oath to say, I'm going to be a leader in this community, then nothing will ever get done. So it's not to say that we don't have it, we do from time immemorial of how we designate land, opportunities, etc. But then again, with this shifting that has happened, people have they've taken the term of prosperity and changed it to self. It's all about me and my nuclear family, right? So that means that I'm gonna do anything to approve this, get the money from this person, and call it a day. That's a shift to our dialogue, which is a collectivist. We're a community. So again, I just say simply, I'm not gonna have some huge diatribe about that. It's simply to say, how do we now shift towards enforcement of what already exists? And how do we ensure we're holding people accountable and ourselves accountable to go back to, again, laws that have always supported us in how we divvy up land, how we make agreements, how we even honor our law, right? The legalities, they are there, but that's what it is. For me, my answer is enforcement, not necessarily reformation, because we have the existing policies.
So can I probe a little bit there in response to Wilbert? Because we are a very community-based society, but at the same time, you're saying we've shifted to a world where it's just me and my family and what we can make, right? How do we bridge that so that accountability matters because I care about the bigger than just me?
And then that's where we talk about this concept of language. We bring it back. Where do we see consistently when we have, we maybe think sometimes it might be hot air when our leaders come up and speak and address the people. But how can we ensure that people who are in positions of power, that new media, Khadija, I haven't forgotten about you, that we're constantly holding the candle to the fire to say, this is what we want, this is what we should reflect, and this is what stands to be our truth. I don't think we are we don't allow ourselves to be empowered enough to speak truth to light because we're looking for ways to address what's an existing problem. So for me, when I've had young kids come to me and say, well, Auntie, how do I, my uncle and aunt are doing this, they believe this, I have no power because I'm the child. But sometimes it's also reflective in action, right? I'm gonna do the right thing, and eventually, hopefully, you will see this behavioral shift and it will have some amplification. And it's not something that happens overnight.
Yes.
This is a time.
Yes.
But the time is now. Bold new
Yes.
normal happens now.
Now.
Right?
Yes.
So the time is now. It's enough complaining and doing the guesswork. We have the digital devices. All of you are equipped with this. You can leave this conversation again, like I said, and remain the same, or choose to actually do something about the problems. We shouldn't be here just having a good time together and engaging in this, but you're now equipped to say, well, my next tweet or X, I don't know what it's called anymore, my next tweet that's going out, it's actually going to call, truth to power about how I feel about how communities should be. If I'm working, to Henny's point here, in the government, what am I also doing within that system to transform? Am I following status quo, which existed from a passive tradition that's been passed on to us, or am I doing something to make a change? That's how we bridge the gap. It's language, it's this connectivity, and it's action. And then when we see that individual action, it will lead to collective action.
Last question.
The MC didn't call me, but I have the mic. I guess I can talk. All right.
Okay.
That's a bold movement.
Yes.
So you go
Yeah.
ahead.
My name is Archie from Type and Rapid Wash. Thank you very much, Lucy, for doing this yearly. Joe mentioned that we can expose ourselves, or we can gain exposure by reading, because a lot of people don't have the opportunity to travel and experience what's outside there. Now, our education system has been set up in a way that you're supposed to read, chew it, and then pour it out, and then forget. So, and it has become a culture. You go to school, you read to pass exam. 2 years after exam, if someone asks you, do you remember this in school, you basically, you forgot it. So how can we change this culture that we have now in our education system? Using the bold new normal vehicle. I mean, Lucy, this is to you. How can the bold new normal partner with the Ghana Education Service to change this culture of chew and pour and pass exam and build a people who are interested in reading and exposing themselves to knowledge, not only in Ghana, but outside of Ghana? How can we achieve this?
So I am going to let Jewel comment, and then actually in the masterclass, this point on education is something I want to touch on. So I'm not going to respond now. Hold that thought for the masterclass, but I want you to have an academic, well, not only academic, that's not the only thing that Jewel does, but a response from someone who obviously has studied this, and we'll talk more in the afternoon. So Jewel.
Okay, perfect. So yes, to your point there, how do we look at this construct when it comes to our education systems? And maybe it's because of the mindset that I have adopted now. Now, I know that there's challenges where we've seen cheating happening across the board when it comes to schools as they're preparing for WASI, et cetera, et cetera. But I had an interesting, this is a lived experience, not an academic experience. I went to International Day of the Girl somewhere in the eastern region. And I was so excited to hear that we were joined by the heads of the Ghana education system for that particular municipality. And the directors were talking about how they're making changes to the curriculum, how they're bringing in more critical thinking and thought. And when you hear those young people, I didn't know what to expect because we were in the outskirts. They're in public schools, right? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, are they going to understand? Even my brofo is too much sometimes for people. So are they going to get this? But these babies were so smart, so pointed, I was blown away by this. And that to me gave me just a glimmer of hope that we continue to point out the negative. And it's no offense, because it is true, it does exist in this dynamic. But there are systems and people, again, who are changing and transforming because someone's continued to call it out. This is wrong. This should not be the way that we learn. This should not be the way that we approach thinking. And this is what we're seeing as these types of students begin to matriculate into university, that they can't keep up. right? They can't think beyond. But the reality is that there's a space for us to begin transforming it right now. But Lucy, you were going to say.
No, I'm so glad I gave that word to you, because that's an answer I wouldn't have had. And I think it's something I thought we should hold on to into the afternoon, because this is really important, that the Nananom and the chiefs and whoever who are pushing for reform, they don't have to be super educated themselves to be willing to push for reform. So we're going to wrap now. Final word still to you, because I'm jealous of the time that we've had with you, and I'm so excited that we get to learn. So very final thought, but the final thought is based on something that's on my mind, and hopefully, again, given all that you've seen and heard, you know more. You know, when we talk about the stories of the ancestry, and then you start to play it forward, right? It was Irabna who talked about the White House example of bringing Hollywood in to reshape narratives. One of the things that concerns me is that as Ghanaians and as Africans, and maybe as Black people as a whole, we consistently expect to catch up with somebody. We consistently expect to close a gap. You can't beat me at a game that I created. You can't. Because I made the rules of my game, right? Now I'm sitting at the edge of my seat, so you know this is serious.
Yes.
And so if we blow that up, we're constantly trying to win at someone else's game. Every single day. So last word to you, how do we think about the outcomes, the game that we should be creating, not trying to become like someone else or another part of the world, but taking all of where we've been and shaping ourselves into where we need to get there, where we win because we called the game.
Exactly. I think that that's amazing. I was looking through just my research notes that I had, and there was one point that I highlighted from Hofstede's work that stood out to me that kind of speaks to what you're saying and his whole research around culture and dynamics. So he said, economic evolution is bound to be reflected in people's collective mental programming, but there's no reason why economic and technological evolution should suppress other cultural variety. What that meant to me...
Yes, in English for us.
Right, you're like, well, it was all these big words.
Right?
Is the fact that most times we are saying to ourselves, you know, we're in this fourth, going forward, industrial revolution, right? Everyone is quantum this, AI this, da-da-da-da-da. And we're not realizing that, you know, this is a world that, or an industrial revolution that people have had time to catch up to build upon, to produce, and they were informed by critical experiences in like a social construct. So whether it was due to war, whether it was due to shifting in mindsets, social cultural changes, that's what led to their industrial revolution. We haven't yet even came to our third industrial revolution. We're now just getting digitized, yet we're doing these quantum leaps into more of this space and trying to force ourselves to understand this without even going back and understanding what were our traditional innovations and how can this potentially be something that we use as a catalyst, right, to understand what's happening in the world around us. What do our people understand? There's a number of people, we look at Ghana and we look at Ghana as Accra. And that's not the reality, right? And so that's a problematic approach because we're assuming everyone is urbanized, digitized, connected, and can catch up to something. But why don't we take a step back and look at what pre-existed, those indigenous knowledge that exists for us, and then for those of us that have gone ahead and we've caught up to what the world is doing, go back and blend this experience and begin creating innovations that are built on this, again, cultural re-embeddedness of our approach to entrepreneurship, innovation, technology, and what the world may be doing, but also respect and encourage our own traditions into that. And that's something I'm a staunch advocate for because I feel as though that's something that has been lost in our journey. So oftentimes, like you said, it may seem like we're always playing catch up with people telling us we're not good enough. When realities, we have certain innovations happening in certain communities that blow the minds of others. We've leapfrogged, even everyone talks about it when it comes to just even financing, right? When we're thinking about that, we've done it. Mobile money, all of these things, the world's trying to catch up to that. But we've managed to find a way that works because it solved a need for our people. And it became something that globally continentally became something that worked for our people. And this is something now the world is trying to catch up to. So why don't we acknowledge that as well? So I just simply say that, again, when we think about economics and evolution and technology, we do have to come back and reference it back to who we are the traditional models, and those indigenous knowledge components that actually can drive our innovation differently and actually cause us to innovate beyond others or bring something new to the global front, because we have a lot to offer.